I would like to introduce Johnny from USIP. Most of you guys know him. So let's give him a round of applause.
All right. Am I on?
Yes.
Got me? Okay, real good. I'm Johnny Miller. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of the Utah County's Indemnity Pool, which is an intergovernmental agency that the commissioners created some 25 years ago so that rather than paying for insurance and having all the extra costs that go along with insurance, the county can self-insure, but because they don't want to take on that responsibility of paying all their claims themselves, they pool with all the other counties in the state, put money into a fund, and whenever you're sued, or you crash up one of the vehicles, or they have fire in the building, money comes out of the fund to pay those claims. So what I'm here today to do is to try and have the county not have to pay so much money into the fund and keep that money in your budget so that you can do the work of the county. And we're going to do that today by talking about discrimination and harassment in the workplace, and make sure that you're aware of what harassment is and is not, and some key tips on how to handle situations when you get into them with employees in harassment situations. So to get started, how many of you are supervisors? Okay, those of you who don't have your hands up, have you ever been asked to shadow another new employee from time to time, or oversee another agency employee as they're doing some work in the county or doing things like that? Maybe, because in that capacity, you're going to be considered a supervisor. A lot of people, the courts recognize supervisors a lot more broadly than the titles of your positions do. So when I'm talking about the responsibilities of supervisors, keep that in mind, that when you are in that type of a capacity, these types of issues where supervisors have a higher responsibility than the normal employee will apply to you as well. Okay? So what we're going to do quickly over the lunch hour today is talk about discrimination, because that's the basis for everything we're going to talk about today. Harassment, a lot of people talk about, they want training on sexual harassment. Well, sexual harassment is just one form of harassment, which is a form of discrimination. And we'll talk about that so that we understand that concept. And then also hostile work environment, which is part of harassment. Then we'll talk about the liability related to harassment, supervisor's liability specifically, the basis for defense of harassment claims, your responsibilities as a supervisor, and the county discrimination and harassment policy we'll go over real quickly. And then we'll finish up with giving you your script of how to handle situations when you're in those situations, okay? This is a lot easier if it's interactive and you ask questions along the way. The key to training is that I leave here and you understand what I talked about, not just that you spent an hour in a room listening to me. So if you have questions along the way, please ask, and we'll still get you out of here in the hour, okay? Discrimination, to start with. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that it's illegal to discriminate against persons based on their race, color, religion, sex, which means gender originally, and national origin. So those were the first list of protected statuses, as they're referred to, as you'll hear them referred to, that were the basis for discrimination. Later on, the ADEA came along and made it illegal to discriminate against persons for age. And then the ADA came along and made it also illegal to discriminate against someone because of a disability. So now we have the protected statuses, which are, say them along with me, race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, and disability. Okay? Those are the keys, and keep those all in mind. You know, repeat them until they're rote in your mind, because when we talk about harassment and hostile work environment and discrimination, if the actions and activities don't go back to one of those protected statuses, it may not be a productive situation, but it's not illegal discrimination or harassment. It has to arise out of one of those protected statuses, okay? So those federal laws that I mentioned make it illegal as an employer, and that's what we're talking about today, to discriminate against someone in the areas of recruitment, selection, promotion, discipline, training, and other actions that alter the terms of employment. I've seen cases where simple things like moving someone from a desk near the window to a desk in the middle of the room where they don't have sunlight being an adverse employment condition that the courts ruled was discriminatory. If they made that decision based on a protected status. It's a very broad range of things that you do as an employer that can be considered discrimination. That's easy, the discrimination piece, because we've all grown up with it. I mean, 64, I was around, but pretty young. So we all understand discrimination, right? Is there anybody that doesn't understand the discrimination part of it? Good. So let's move on to harassment then, which is a form of discrimination that the courts really created later on. There's nothing in the federal statutes that prohibits sexual harassment specifically. There's nothing in the statutes that talks about harassment. This was a creation of the courts that arose out of specifically harassment based on sexual, or discrimination based on sex. And we use the term harassment. The general definition of harassment, if you go to Webster's dictionary, is to annoy or bother someone in a constant or repeated way. Now, if that was truly the definition of harassment, how many people work with somebody that annoy you in a constant way? Every one of us. There's always one, one or more in the group that are like that. So the courts choose not to use this broad of a definition because, as we see here, people are too easily offended. They're too easily annoyed. And this is the first and last group therapy session for the easily offended. And the first lady in the group says, apples and oranges, what's that supposed to mean? You think I'm some kind of fruit? And the next gentleman says, wait, you? As in you people? And the next gentleman says, oh, I get it. This is all somehow about my weight, isn't it? And the last gal says, oh, typical vegan, non-vegan response. People are offended in so many different ways, you just can't anticipate what types of things are going to offend any one person, right? So we have to have a more narrow definition of what's going to be illegal activity offending someone that's going to be harassment. So we go back to the definition of harassment. Let's look at the legal definition in Black's Law Dictionary. And they say it's the systematic and or continued unwanted offensive actions of one party or group, including threats or demands. So we'll break that down quickly. First of all, systematic and or continued. So it's not just a one-time event. It's something that's ongoing and regular that makes it harassment. It's also unwanted. If two people are telling jokes and they're both okay with it, is that harassment?
I hope not.
It shouldn't be. When I first started doing this training, people were really worried that that's what it was. You just couldn't tell jokes anymore. You couldn't have fun. You couldn't, touch each other at all. But as we'll find out, that's not the case. And this unwanted piece, we're going to talk about quite a bit because that's key to how you handle the situations. Of course, again, offensive actions. when we talk about offensive here, again, demonstration. Old couple goes into the doctor's office. The old gentleman's having some symptoms, and the doctor comes in and he says, "We don't know what is going on here, so we're going to have to run a battery of tests. So what I'm going to need from you is a urine sample, a sperm sample, and a stool sample." And the old man turns to his wife and says, "What did he say?" And she says, "He says he wants your underwear." Now that may be offensive to someone, but is it offensive in a way that I've hit any of the protected statuses? Possibly age. Got me. But some young guys, they just need to hand him his underwear too. But again, when we talk about offensive here, we mean offensive in a way that it's discriminating against one of the protected statuses to be illegal harassment. So, and again, what's going to offend whom? Here we've got Miranda, who the caption is, while not legally binding, everyone figured it was just a good idea to go along with Miranda's warning. And Miranda's warning on the sign is, "You have the right to remain silent, as anything you say will likely offend me." You will have your employees and others say things that might offend others in the workplace. It's your job as a supervisor to sort out, is it a protected status or isn't it? Is that the basis for it? If it is, now we go down the road of harassment. If it isn't, it's really more of a productivity issue of if you're saying things that are offensive to others, whether it's illegal harassment or not, that might not create a productive workplace, and so you deal with that. Okay? And also, slippery slope. That today it's just an offensive joke that doesn't have anything to do with race, color, religion, national origin, age, or disability. But next week, the jokes might start to go that direction, right? Now let's look at the Supreme Court's view as far as what they consider illegal harassment as an employer. It's illegal to harass anyone in the workplace based on race, color, sex, religion, national origin, age, disability, and protected activity. The courts more or less added same-sex marital and lifestyle to those protected activities recently, haven't they? So all of those things fall under that harassment venue now by the Supreme Court. Again, the Supreme Court specifically defines harassment as conduct, again, that's unwelcome, first of all, and then conduct that's sufficiently severe or pervasive, and we'll get to that definition in a second. Right now, let's do it. Severe or pervasive. Generally, a single event or an isolated incident is not enough to create a hostile work environment or a harassment situation. Generally, if it is severe enough, then it does lead to a harassment situation. A well-known racial slur, clear putting the hands on the body and sexually assaulting someone. Because that's so severe, it doesn't need to have happened more than once. Okay? The Supreme Court stated in recent decisions that Title VII does not prohibit all verbal or physical harassment in the workplace, which is interesting that they would even say that, and most people are really surprised by that. Harassment can go on in the workplace, both physical and verbal forms of it. What's illegal is the behavior so objectively offensive that it alters the conditions of the victim's employment. So again, it needs to be tied to the protected status. It needs to be unwelcome. It needs to be severe or pervasive. And it needs to affect that person's ability to do their job, or you affect their job somehow as the employer. Okay? So simple teasing, offhand comments, and those sorts of things, those may lead to some disciplinary actions to keep it from elevating, but it's not going to rise to the level of illegal harassment. All right. So again, it needs to be altering the terms and conditions of employment in the mind of the victim. So if the person who's being harassed feels that they aren't able to do their job very well anymore because of this harassment, it goes to that level of being a hostile work environment, of being harassment. But if we were to leave it in the mind of just the victim, wouldn't everything be harassment? They could easily claim all the time that they're not able to get their job done because of what's going on in the workplace. So the court also says it not only in the mind of the victim, but from the perspective of a reasonable person in the victim's position. Now when the court talks about reasonable person in the position of the victim, who are they talking about? What group of people?
Just like you.
Someone just like you? And what do the courts use to identify a group of people that's just like you? A jury. Yes, a jury. So the person brings their claim in front of a jury and they decide, yeah, in that same situation, I could see where my ability to do my job would be affected by that type of harassment. But as the guy who writes the checks for all the counties in this state, believe me, get it right. You see here, the bailiff comes out and says, they have a technical question, sir. Is it heads is guilty and tails not guilty, or the other way around? And there are times where I really wonder if that's what's going on back in that jury room. We have a sexual harassment claim that we've been defending for one of the counties over the last 4 or 5 years now, have spent about $350,000, $400,000 on defense of this case. And the judge was looking to throw the case out before going to the jury because he felt that the plaintiff just simply hadn't met their burden to show that any harassment, that the change in the work was tied to the harassment that she was claiming. But he decided rather than throw it out, he was going to let the jury have their day, let the person have their day in court, and felt that the jury would find the right verdict. Well, the jury came back with, yes, it was harassment. The decision for the county to shut down an entire department and lay the entire department off was really just aimed at getting rid of this one employee who had claimed sexual harassment, even though they hired her back almost immediately into another department, and found that the individual supervisor who was the person who was supposedly did the harassment found a judgment of $250,000 against that individual, and additional monies against the county. That's how odd these juries can go. And the judge actually right now is reviewing motions to throw out the jury's decision and rule from the bench, because they did not base their decision on the law. So hopefully the judge will do the right thing there. We're going to talk about the two major types of harassment: quid pro quo harassment and harassment between two employees, which the courts consider hostile work environment. Quid pro quo is the type of discrimination that we all grew up with. The boss that expects sexual favors from his secretary if she wants to keep her job and get promotions, right? We grew up with that in the movies and on TV and things. So it's submission or rejection of sexual advances. It can't be the basis for employment decisions. This is one that the courts are absolutely intolerant of. But it has to be between a supervisor, somebody that can change or alter the employment status of another person, of the person that they're looking for sexual favors from. This can't quid pro quo can't happen between two employees of equal stature. Also, if it's a supervisor in another department who really has no control over that employee's employment status, it wouldn't be quid pro quo. It's the supervisor that can affect that person's employment status, okay? So then we get to hostile work environment, where we're talking about harassment between two people at the same level that can't affect one another's employment. And the definition is harassing conduct that creates an intimidating, hostile, or a offensive work environment for any employee, customer, or vendor to the point of interfering with workplace performance. Now we've expanded a little bit, haven't we? Because now we're also talking about and recognizing that it's not just between two of your employees. You are to protect your employees from harassment, including that comes from customers, vendors. So you've got other agencies that you work with. You have other departments of the county. You have the city people that you work with. You have vendors that will come into the building to work on the computers and maintenance and things like that. If they're harassing your employees, as supervisors, you have an obligation to stop that as well and deal with that. And in the jail, that's a tough one. I mean, to keep your employees safe from harassment from the inmates, I've yet to see that claim, but I can't believe that it won't come eventually, that you have an obligation to protect your employees from harassment from the inmates. So good luck with that, people. Tough job. All right? But again, it needs to interfere with the workplace performance. Real quickly, forms of harassment, they can be physical, verbal, or nonverbal. And I'm going to go through these really fast because when you say that they're verbal or nonverbal, you're saying it could be anything. And it can be anything. These are just the most typical ones that you'll see. So physical harassment, and from the really egregious to the almost getting to the gray area we'll go. Actual or attempted rape or assault, no question, that's physical harassment. Hitting, touching, poking, all of that kind of stuff, any physical contact can be harassment. Touching or rubbing oneself in front of someone else is physical harassment. Impeding or blocking someone's movement, the leaning, cornering, standing too close, and those two seem to be the two that are always part of the complaint. He would always just stand in the doorway or block my way, between the copier and the fax machine, so I couldn't get by unless I'd rub up against him. So watch for that kind of stuff happening in your department. Verbal harassment, we've got racial or ethnic slurs, and again, no tolerance in the courts for that type of stuff. Pressuring someone for dates or sexual favors, teasing and jokes and things that, again, go back to sex, race, age, disability, religion. If it's a joke about a protected status, and the person lets you know it's offensive to them and it's unwelcome, it's got to stop. Sexual comments about person's clothing or anatomy. Again, it's kind of how do you deliver it. When one of the gals shows up one day and she's dressed extra, more nicer than usual, and you say, boy, you look great today. Probably not harassment. But when you say, wow, who are you trying to take home tonight with that outfit? That's probably harassment. So it can be as much the way you say it as what you're trying to get at. Personal questions about social or sexual life. Referring to adults as girl, boy, babe, honey, those type of pet names that people use. And again, don't see this as much today in our society as when I first started doing this training years ago. I tell this story, I have done this training all over the country for different government agencies. And I spent a week in our office down in Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama. And at the end of the week, after spending the whole week with the staff there, I still didn't know anybody's real name because everybody in the office had a pet name, and especially the women. They were all sugar baby, pumpkin pie, sweet thing, and they went by those names. But it was okay with them. They were okay with it. Everybody was fine with it, so it wasn't a hostile work environment. Okay? On the nonverbal harassment, making sexual gestures, like this guy down in the left corner, leering, staring, or suggestive looks, facial expressions, looking people up and down, and that's one that we get all the time, that he just would always be checking me out. Well, how do you prove or disprove that was going on? But it's something for you as a supervisor to watch for. Giving unwanted personal gifts, suggestive or offensive emails, texts, and posters. If you've got employees that put this stuff in writing, in an email or a text, you've probably got some real issues with employees right off the bat, especially in your line of work. They should know better than to put that kind of stuff in writing. Derogatory posters, drawings, and cartoons. It can be as simple as leaving religious pamphlets on a coworker's desk. Religious-based. If they told you that it's unwanted and unwelcome, can't continue to do it. And there's been some cases on that have shown that that's how far the court will take it. Okay? So, I used to see a lot of the girly posters in the highway shops and in the jail and other places. I don't see that hardly ever anymore, but if you see it, it should be gone. So, non-supervisor harassment claims. Again, this is between two employees. It's not the quid pro quo type harassment. The employer, the county, is only liable for actionable harassment by a non-supervisor if it knew or should have known about the harassment and failed to take prompt remedial measures. So, should or should have known. If you did know, and you chose to ignore it or just wait to see if the department knew what was going on, it was pretty obvious, then we're going to be up against the should have known issue. So again, it's incumbent on you as supervisors to keep an eye out. If you hear and see some of the things we just talked about, and you can see that it might be bothering someone or affecting their ability to do their job, you need to take action. Because you will be responsible for that. To defend against those types of claims, what we have to show is that you exercised reasonable care to prevent or correct the behavior promptly. And prevent is what we're doing here today. We do the training almost annually to make sure that people understand what their obligations are. So we're doing what we can to prevent it, but also to correct it. And that's where the discipline part comes in. So when we talk about the policy and disciplinary action, pay attention, because the problem here is if one department doesn't discipline when this happens, the courts recognize the county as one employer. And especially with the sheriff's department, you are a lot more of a different animal than the rest of the county in a lot of ways. But what I have to deal with in the courts is they don't like to see disparate treatment between employees in one department and in another. So if the road crew department head lets his people get away with harassment and doesn't discipline them, when we try and discipline people in the sheriff's office, the court doesn't allow us to do that, because that's disparate treatment. So every department has to make sure that they're disciplining, correcting the behavior. Okay? The other thing that we can defend against is that we can show that the employee unreasonably failed to utilize preventive or corrective opportunities. in the policy we'll see that there are that the employee is supposed to report harassment. Other employees that see it going on are supposed to report harassment. If the employee doesn't report it, doesn't follow through the procedure to get the investigation done and those sorts of things, they don't have a case in court. Okay? It'll get thrown out after we spend $50,000 or so to get to that point where the judge actually throws the case out. All right, so let's talk about your liability issues as supervisors. In 1998, the U.S. Supreme Court issued two different decisions, and I'm going to boil them down so that we don't have to go through each individual one. But what they said, more or less, was an employer is automatically liable for harassment by a supervisor when the supervisor's harassment results in a tangible adverse employment action. Unlike on the criminal side, on the civil side, there are situations occasionally where you are guilty until you prove yourself innocent, and this is one of them. If there's an allegation against you as a supervisor that you were sexually harassing an employee, and that led to a decision to adversely affect their employment, you now have to prove that that didn't happen. They don't have to prove that it did. They just need to make the allegation. That's not an easy spot to be in. So what is that tangible adverse employment action that has to happen? Obviously firing, any decrease in pay, denial of promotion, reassignment, significant change in benefits, reprimands. I mean, all of that gamut. If they can tie or if you can't show that the harassment and that action weren't tied to one another, you are guilty. So as we defend that, we must show that no tangible adverse employment action was connected to the alleged harassment. So you, or we, together, have to prove that either there was no tangible adverse employment action, that what happened, they rotated to a new shift. And everybody rotates to a new shift from time to time. And now they're claiming that you changed their shift to the graveyard because they complained of harassment. No, that's not why. If we can show that, we can be out of the claim. Or we can show that the action that was taken wasn't connected to the harassment. Like in this case I talked about in the other county, the county made a financial decision to shut down a non-performing department that they couldn't continue to afford to run anymore. It wasn't based on the fact that a supervisor in that department was harassing one of their employees. That's what we tried to show. In these claims where it's a supervisor and an employee and there's been an adverse employment action, those are the only two defenses that we can bring to the court. Defenses of, it really wasn't harassment. It wasn't really that bad. It wasn't that big of a deal. All of that goes out the window. They asked for it. They really want it. It really wasn't unwelcome. All of those defenses are gone. These are the only two defenses you can bring up. Okay? So it does, for you supervisors, it creates a very high level of liability that we want to keep you protected from. And then we need to talk about retaliation claims, because this is another area that the courts are extremely intolerant of. Any action against an employee for complaining of, providing witness statement about, or otherwise supporting a victim of discrimination of harassment is considered retaliation by the courts. So you need to be really careful about that one. If you have a complaint of sexual harassment in your command, you need to make sure that that person who made the complaint, everyone else in the command understands there can be no retaliation. There can be no, we're only going to have lunch together on days that they're out of the office. We're not going to invite them to outside events anymore. We're not going to include them in the water cooler discussions anymore. All of that kind of stuff, you're going to pay for. Because this is the claim that the plaintiff's attorneys always add on to a harassment claim. And if they can prove this piece up, that's where the bill starts getting really big. Typically what the courts will do is they'll target whatever the actual damages for the harassment was. The claim for retaliation, they just take that amount and triple it for the fact that retaliation was allowed to occur. So, your responsibilities as a supervisor, make sure you train your employees, know your policy and follow it. That's one that we get tagged on all the time. County has a good policy, but you didn't follow it. And how do you explain that to the court? They have this expectation that every person, especially supervisors, know and understand that policy throughout and follow it daily. And we all know that isn't always the case. How many of you have read the county's entire personnel policy ever, or even in the last year? You know, a couple hands, that's good. You need to manage all the incidences and complaints. Do not let them sit. They will only get worse. And coordinate with personnel and discipline when it's required. And you need to set the example, obviously. Employee responsibilities, they need to attend their training, know the policy as well. They need to notify the offender that behavior is unwelcome and is offensive to them. And that's part of the policy, is that the employee needs to let that person know that they're offended by the behavior. But from the court's perspective, if the employee comes to you, or say you've noticed something, you go to the employee and say, I noticed that this may be offending you. Have you told the person that it's offensive to you and that you want it to stop? Well, no, I'm really uncomfortable doing that. It now becomes your responsibility to have that discussion, to go to the person and let them know what you're doing really offends Jim. It's based on his religion. You have to stop that. That is harassment. You're on notice now that it is offensive and it needs to stop. If it continues, it will be considered harassment. We'll have to move forward with an investigation and appropriate discipline. That becomes your responsibility, okay? If you're uncomfortable with it, start up the chain of command. And if we get to the personnel department or the county attorney's office to have that conversation, somebody's got to do it, all right? And the employees, again, they have to report harassment if it continues or if they see it. The county harassment policy, and I'm going to boil this down really quickly. It describes harassment in one paragraph, a lot simpler than I did, but it describes it in the same way. It requires disciplinary action be taken if harassment has occurred. Requires it, it's not a judgment call. It must be done. It provides options for reporting. There's several different places that an employee can report harassment to: their supervisor, the sheriff, or any department head, the HR department directly, the county attorney's office directly, or any of the county commissioners. So hopefully they can find someone in that whole list that isn't harassing them that they can go to. And I don't know, in Box Elder, you just never know. So they have all those options. When you do your training, make sure that piece is covered, that they know that they've got options of different people they can go to make a report. It requires that complaints be in writing. However, if it's a clear situation where an investigation needs to happen, move forward with the investigation. Do not wait for that requirement for the in writing, because the courts aren't going to consider that they had to provide it in writing. Your investigative process can clear that up and get them to sign a statement, something like that. But the response shouldn't be, the policy requires that you provide this in writing, and I'm not doing a thing until you put it in writing. That if it continues and they bring a lawsuit, the courts are not going to let you use that as an excuse for not taking corrective action. All employees must report harassment that's observed as part of the policy. Supervisors must take action under the policy. Again, it's not left to make major judgment calls when it is harassment. Again, when it's the questionable stuff, when you're first at that level of just notifying the person that it's offensive and unwanted, those are your judgment calls to handle those situations. Once it's clear that it's harassment, you have to take action so that an investigation is conducted. Requires an investigation. Now, these are a couple that aren't in the Box Elder County policy right now. They are in every other county policy that I've reviewed in the last couple of years, and so I'm going to be recommending that the county add these to their policy as we're working through updating the county's policy. Typically, if you do an investigation and there's a finding that it wasn't harassment, then there's no record of that in the personnel policy. Box Elder's policy is moot on that. It doesn't say that there would be anything in the file or there wouldn't be, but I'll suggest that it's clarified that there wouldn't be. The other one that, again, is very common that I'm going to suggest that the county adopt is if false allegations are made, that person who made false allegations be disciplined. Because how harmful is that to someone's reputation and their ability to do their job with the other employees when these false allegations have been made against them and they've had to go through all the defending themselves, especially where you have to defend yourself because you're guilty until proven innocent. Right? So look for those. Work under the assumption that those are part of the policy. It's best practice. So now, to wrap up, here's your script. If you're a supervisor, here's how you handle the situation when somebody comes to you with an issue about harassment. If you're not a supervisor, here's what you can expect to hear if you go and talk to your supervisor about harassment. First of all, have you let the other person know that the behavior is unwelcome or offensive? If the answer is no, then you discuss with them how we're going to let that person know that it's offensive. If the answer is yes, I've done that already, and it continues, then now you're at the investigative stage right off the bat, aren't you? Is the harassment affecting your ability to do your job, and how? Because again, that has to happen for it to be illegal harassment, actionable in the courts. So right from the start, you want to get what it is that they're claiming they can't do anymore effectively so that you can document that. And in case the story changes, because it's amazing how a lot of these claims never come until some disciplinary action is taken against the employee for some other reason, or the ability for them to do their job increases as they start talking to an attorney. So get that as soon as possible. Harassment's a serious violation of county policy, and I'll be forwarding your complaint for an investigation. Many employees will come to you and say, I don't want you to do anything about this. This is just between you and I, but here's what's going on. You can't let that happen. Again, the policy states you need to take action. So let them know that right up front, that you don't have any discretion there. It has to move forward for investigation if what they're telling you is harassment, okay? And even if it's just letting that other person know that it's offensive and unwelcome, you need to do that because you need to correct the behavior, okay? The county will attempt to keep this as confidential as possible, but understand it cannot be kept completely confidential. That's another one that I see supervisors make that mistake and lose the trust of their employee over this. The person says, I don't want anybody else to find out, okay? Oh, no, don't worry. We will keep this completely confidential. Well, when an investigation's done, you're going to be talking to them, you're going to be talking to all their co-employees that possibly witnessed the harassment, you're going to be talking to the person who conducted the harassment, alleged to have conducted the harassment, you're going to be talking to former supervisors, possibly other people. So how can that be kept completely confidential? It can't, and the courts recognize that. So yes, keep it as confidential as possible within the department, within your shift, or as confidential as you can. People in other departments or down in Weber County shouldn't know about it, but they can't. Don't promise them complete confidentiality. You can't keep that promise. And lastly, the retaliation issue. If you feel you or others are being retaliated against as a result of reporting this claim, you must come to me and report that immediately, because that piece, people, please be sure you stop immediately and let those other employees know how serious that is. Okay? What we're talking about here is just having a workplace that has dignity and respect and courtesy for all the employees, trying to keep a productive workplace free of harassment, and hopefully what I've shared with you in the last hour will help you to get that done. So with that, any questions? Really, I covered it, nailed it. All right, great. Well, thank you.